So I have always been fascinated by the ocean. I think that's probably just a hazard or natural consequence of growing up in a landlocked state. I had a few opportunities growing up and since then as an adult to visit the ocean, and I've always just loved sitting there and watching it. But as we know, the ocean can also be a place of great destruction and chaos. Last Sunday, I was thinking about this message and I was scrolling through my social media feed and I came across this video of something called a rogue wave or a sleeper or sneaker wave. And these are huge waves that come out of nowhere. They're unexpected, they're unpredictable. It's just one single large wave that's big enough to perhaps capsize a boat, or it comes up on the shore and can take swimmers and people on the beach out to sea. They are unusually large and they are extremely dangerous both to ships and to swimmers. But there's no explainable cause for them. They don't happen because of a storm or a tsunami or an earthquake. They can come out of just a perfectly clear and sunny day. And even to this day, with all of our technology, there's not a whole lot of explanation for why these rogue waves come about. But I just was watching these videos and I get into that, kind of sucked into watching more and more, and it was just breathtaking to see these huge waves toss boats about like they were just tiny toys. Or there's this other ocean phenomenon known as the Drake Lake or the Drake Shake. So this is something that happens as you are boarding a boat or a ship and you're leaving South America, perhaps Chile or Argentina, and you're wanting to go down to Antarctica. You have to cross through something called the Drake Passage. And this is historically one of the most dangerous and treacherous places to sail. And sailors, even today, fear going through this part of the ocean. But it's interesting because, again, it's very unpredictable. Sometimes you go through the Drake Passage and it's completely calm, placid and still, hardly a wave rocking the boat. And at those times they call it the Drake Lake because you may as well just be out on the lake on a sunny day. But at other times, the waves can be so huge and your ship can be rocking and you see videos of people and they can hardly walk down the halls. They're stumbling like they're drunk. They can't even get out of their rooms because they're so seasick. And at those times, it's called the Drake Shake because you shake up the boat. But again, this is just one of those oceanic phenomenon that is completely unpredictable. That even with all of our data, even with all of our technology to be able to track weather patterns, even after we as humans have been sailing the seas for hundreds of years, there is still so much about the ocean that we don't understand, that we can't predict, that can be very dangerous to us. And I find that amazing that even after all these years, there's something that we can't explain. Now, our story for today, which I just read, it doesn't take place on the ocean. It takes place on a lake. We know this lake better as the Sea of Galilee. I think I have a picture that maybe shows a little bit more where it's at, maybe. If not, that's all right. I'll kind of explain it. It's in the northern part of Israel, and right at the tip of it is Capernaum. Now, Capernaum was kind of the home base for Jesus in his ministry. The story we read about last week where Jesus healed a paralyzed man, it took place in Capernaum. And it was right there on the northwest shores of the Sea of Galilee. It's also known today as Lake Tiberias. So if we go back to the beginning of the chapter, Mark 4, it says that Jesus began to teach beside the lake again. And such a large crowd gathered that he climbed into a boat there on the shore. And he sat in the boat while the whole crowd was nearby on the shore. So I imagine that, as he's sitting on this boat or standing on this boat, it's kind of like a natural platform or stage for him. And you have the water that sort of serves as an amplification system as his voice goes across the water. And then there's whole crowds of people kind of sitting on the shore and perhaps as it rises up out of the water that are listening to him, that are listening to his teaching. But these crowds, they followed Jesus everywhere. We learned that in our story from last week where the crowd was so heavy that they couldn't even get the paralyzed man in to see him in the house where he was at. And I imagine that as he's been teaching and preaching all day, Jesus wants to get a little distance from this crowd. So his disciples and him, they get into a boat, they push off from the shore, and they say, we're going to go ahead and go to the other side of the lake. Now, where are they going? So to that, we have to look towards the next chapter, Mark 5, and we read this story about how they land in a region known as the Gerasenes, or the Decapolis, which was a region of 10 Greek cities. It was a Gentile region. And so there, as they reached the opposite shore, Jesus healed a demon-possessed man before getting back into the boat and heading back to Galilee and Capernaum, which was kind of, again, his home base for ministry. So now that we know kind of where we're at geographically, where are we at in this story? And I think to understand that, we have to go all the way back to the beginning of Scripture, all the way back to where creation began in Genesis chapter 1. As we look at the creation story in Genesis chapter 1, we see that God began to create. And when God created, the earth was nothing but a swirling, formless sea. It was a deep void. Genesis 1:2 says that the earth was complete chaos, and depending on the translation you read, and it says that a darkness covered the deep sea. But yet God's Spirit hovered over it. God's Spirit swept over the face of these chaotic waters. God's presence was there in the darkness. And then God began to create. God first separated the light from the darkness, creating day and night. And then a little bit later, God created land and separated it from these chaotic waters. Now, this is so interesting to me because a lot of times as Christians, we have this idea or this belief that God created out of nothing. That there was nothing there, just totally blank space, empty universe, and then God spoke, and there was something. But the Jewish interpretation of creation is not of God creating something out of nothing. Rather, the Hebrew Bible views creation as God taming the chaotic waters of the deep. Through creation, God is organizing the waters. God is putting everything into its proper place, creating boundaries between the land and the sea, creating separation between the light and the dark, and bringing peace and order to a chaotic universe. Now, as we read throughout the Old Testament, we see time and time again how many ocean stories there are, how much water is viewed as this destructive and chaotic force. We think about Noah and the boat in the ark with his family kept safe for 40 days and 40 nights while floods covered the earth. Or again, we have the story of Jonah, who gets in a boat after disobeying God, and a huge storm comes up, and the sailors, they think, we're going to die. This boat is going to crash. We see this again and again throughout the Psalms, how God is the one who has control over the waters, over the chaos. Psalm 104, 6-9 says this: "You covered the watery deep like a piece of clothing." So that goes back to creation when God's Spirit hovered over the darkness. The waters were higher than the mountains. I think of those rogue waves that I saw where you have these huge waves just tossing ships about. But at your rebuke, the waves ran away. They fled in fear at the sound of your thunder. They flowed over the mountains, streaming down the valleys to the place you established for them. You set a boundary that they cannot cross so that they'll never again cover the earth. So the Psalm 104, views God as taming the waters of creation. Psalm 33:7 also says that God gathered the ocean waters into a heap and placed them into a storeroom. I think that's really beautiful imagery. And finally, Psalm 65:7 says that you silenced the roaring of the seas and the roaring of their waves. So again, we see the ocean, we see water as this destructive, chaotic force, and God is the only one who can bring order to that chaos, who can still the waves, who can calm the storms. So we're back on the boat in the Sea of Galilee, and a storm comes up out of nowhere. And the disciples were so afraid, and I think they have every right to be afraid. At least 4 of them that we know were experienced fishermen. They had lived their whole lives on this lake. This was how they earned a living. So if a storm was so bad that they thought they were going to die, it must have been some gale indeed. In discussing this storm, Dr. A.J. Levine, who wrote the book Signs and Wonders, she talks about her own history of growing up by the ocean. And again, I didn't grow up by the ocean, so I really liked what she had to say. She said that because she lived in New Bedford, Massachusetts, her family, they owned a fishing business, and because she spent her whole life by the ocean, She learned from a very young age to take the ocean seriously. She tells a story of that before she was even born, her mother's father, her grandfather, he went out into the ocean, a squall came up out of nowhere, and he drowned. This was a man who, again, he was a fisherman. He spent his entire life on the ocean, and unexpectedly, he drowned in a storm. She also tells a story about how one of her family's commercial fishing boats, a 90-foot-long boat, it went out of the harbor, and it never came back. No SOS signal, no wreckage, no debris. They have no idea what happened to it. So as we think about water, we think about how it's reflected in the Bible and in our own experiences, we see that water represents danger. Water represents chaos. Storms represent destruction and confusion. And that's where the disciples find themselves in this boat. Now, we're Midwesterners. We don't know much about hurricanes, but we do know a thing or two about tornadoes. And if I think of what is the most destructive force of nature that I've ever seen, I think about the time when I was living in Enid, Oklahoma in 2013, and a huge EF5 tornado swept through the city of Moore, a suburb of Oklahoma City. It was so crazy to me. We lived about 2 hours away, and it was a perfectly clear, sunny day. Well, at the same time, on the outskirts of Oklahoma City, this tornado was causing huge destruction. We went there about a week later to help with the cleanup, and just entire neighborhoods were flattened. Whole streets of houses were just taken down to their foundation. So I think that we can sympathize about the power and nature of the storms as we put ourselves in the disciples' place, as we sympathize with them who were crying out to Jesus saying, "Teacher, don't you care that we are dying?" But at the same time, I can't help but give the disciples a little bit of grief. So we're coming to this story. It's Mark chapter 4. They had already spent some time with Jesus. He'd already performed several miracles. He had healed the paralyzed man, as we saw last week. He had cast out demons. He had healed lepers. He had cured physical ailments and sicknesses. A man with a withered hand, Simon's own mother, had a fever, and Jesus healed her. So surely by now, the disciples were starting to put two and two together. Surely by now, they were starting to realize that Jesus was no ordinary man, that there was something different, something special about him. So it's no wonder that Jesus looks around at them and says, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith after all this time?" And then even after Jesus calmed the storm, they looked around each other, they shrugged their shoulders, and they said, "Who is this? Who is this man that even the winds and the waves and the sea obey him?" But the answer should have been obvious. These were good, faithful Jewish disciples. They had read about creation. They had read about the Psalms. They had known how God is the one who has control over the storms. So when they asked, "Who is this that controls the wind and the waves?" the answer should have been clear. This is what God does. This is God. Because of this, they had no reason to fear the storm, because the one who brought peace and order to the chaos of pre-creation, this same one was sleeping in the back of their boat. Yet they were still afraid. And how does Jesus respond? Jesus meets them in their place of fear. Now, as we learned last week, and as I mentioned on Ash Wednesday, Jesus never did miracles for his own sake, for his own glory, for his own accolade or acclaim. It would have been easy to gather disciples and gather followers if he was doing these things just to show off and impress. But rather, Jesus performed miracles always out of great love for others, out of great compassion and care and concern for them. And this is the same thing for these disciples. Jesus could have used this to show that he was God, but clearly that didn't work because they still didn't figure out that he was God. Instead, Jesus cared for them so much that he stilled the storm. He brought them from a place of fear to a place of calm. Now, like the disciples, we often want to proclaim to God, "Don't you care about us down here? What are you even doing? Are you asleep? won't you wake up and help us? We may not be fishermen on a storm that's threatening our lives, but there are so many things that we have to be afraid of in our society. We fear things like mass shootings. We fear pandemics that can come out of nowhere. We fear other natural disasters. We fear health concerns, car accidents. We might have fears that are more intangible, such as not having enough money for retirement or getting into debt in some way. We fear that a loved one might get sick or pass away. We fear the effects of climate change. We fear the dangerous weather that it could bring. We are often like the disciples, and we are fearful. We are asking God, where are you? Won't you wake up? Don't you care about us? But like the disciples, we need to remember that Jesus is with us in the boat. Jesus isn't going to leave us to face these fears and storms alone. Jesus doesn't bail out when the storms of life are getting really bad and surging around us and our anxiety seems to overwhelm us. Jesus is there to meet us in our place of fear, to speak calm and peace into our lives, to bring comfort like only he can. Jesus does care for us is the answer to that question, perhaps especially when we are in a place of fear. As we learned last week, Jesus cares for our physical being, but also our spiritual wholeness. And I think this story shows that Jesus cares for our emotional health as well. Jesus cares for our hopes and our dreams, but Jesus cares for our fears and our concerns and our anxieties. And when we can live life to the fullest, it's because we have placed those things into Jesus' hands. We can bring our fears to him, no matter how big or small. And here's where I really find comfort in this story. Think back to that creation story. God, who created the universe, who brought order and calm to chaos, the one who holds power over nature and storms, that is the same God that comforts us in our fears. Again, no matter how big or small, God has compassion on us, just like Jesus had compassion on those disciples when he stilled the storm. God isn't going to dismiss our anxieties or concerns. God isn't sleeping through the storm. God is right there, meeting us in that place of fear. And one last point before I begin to wrap this up. A.J. Levine points out that there was this quick kind of throwaway line that there were other boats that had followed Jesus. Other boats were out there on the lake. We don't know what happened to them. We don't know if their storms were still too. They didn't have Jesus in their boat. And even when we have Jesus in our boat, following Jesus does not mean that we will have a storm-free life. I'm sure those disciples faced many other storms in their life, both literal, metaphoric, or physical storms, but also metaphorical storms as they began to preach and teach after Jesus' ascension. There were many other times when they probably feared for their lives and called out, "Don't you care about us, God? What are you doing?" But even when we can't feel Jesus, even when we can't see Jesus, we have to have this faith and confidence that Jesus is there in the storms of our life with words of peace and stillness and reassurance. Jesus is longing to carry us safely to the other side. Jesus reminds us that he is both the Lord and creator of nature, but also the comforter and consoler of our souls. Jesus is the one who brings peace and calm into our lives, not always calming the storms, but assuring us when those storms come up.